Beyond the waters of the Rhine and Danube stretches a land some say can never be truly conquered, a frontier where the authority of empires holds no sway. Within its vast wilderness of dense forests, rivers, and marshes dwells a people as untamed as the land itself. Yet the Romans would have you believe these peoples are mere barbarians, primitive and troublesome tribes, destined to be crushed by their mighty legions, as they've done with the Gauls before them. After all, have not the gods themselves destined the Romans to bring civilization to every corner of the world? And yet, a wise general would heed caution when marching his armies into these lands, for deep within the dark forests of Germania, the trees seem to whisper in strange tongues. Its peoples may appear uncivilized, its many different tribes fractured and of little significance on their own, but when given a common enemy, they may prove willing to put their petty tribal squabbles aside and unite. When the headstrong warriors of Germania refuse to bend the knee to a foreign conqueror, Rome may be forced to recognize the limits of its own ambition. This is a time of war. By the 4th century, the Romans had been the undisputed masters of Western Europe and the Mediterranean for almost half a millennium. Over the course of centuries, they had conquered countless kingdoms and peoples, incorporating them into an empire that stretched from Britannia to Mesopotamia. In doing so, they established frontiers that would come to define the high watermark for the Roman world, and shape its conflicts with neighboring peoples for centuries to come. In Europe, the frontiers were marked by the natural barrier of the Rhine and Danube rivers, but this had not always been considered the definitive frontier. For the Romans, the forests of Germania were once just one of several logical directions for expansion. Expeditions into Germania Magna began during the time of Julius Caesar in 55 BC, when in addition to his campaign in Gaul, Caesar's gaze was drawn towards Germania Magna by Germanic incursions across the Rhine into Gaul. For the barbarians, these rivers were formidable obstacles. If you consider that the Rhine is a fast-flowing river that typically stretches a few hundred meters in width, and that the shores of narrower sections are usually hemmed in by steep cliffs, one can begin to imagine the many challenges any crossing attempts are faced with. In order to reliably cross, they were dependent on natural fords where they could wade through the water. Additionally, they could ferry their troops and supplies across by boat, but both of these methods severely hindered their logistical capacities, limiting the size and speed of their raiding parties when going into Roman territory. Alternatively, during exceptionally cold winters, the rivers could freeze over with thick ice, providing opportunities for them to cross over with much greater numbers and supplies. But naturally, raiding during harsh winter conditions brought hardships and challenges in different ways. Nevertheless, apparently the Germanic tribes considered the material gains to be plundered over on the Roman side to be worth the effort. Once the raiders returned to Germania, they would be safe from reprisals, or so they thought. Caesar, recognizing the potential an expedition into Germania had to further bolster his military reputation, used these barbarian excursions as a reason to cross the river himself. He ordered his legions to build a large wooden bridge across the Rhine. The Roman engineers constructed pile drivers to ram long wooden piles deep into the riverbed. Despite the bridge being estimated to be roughly 7 meters wide and possibly several hundred meters in length to stretch the entire width of the river, it took only 10 days for the bridge to be completed and his legions to march across. In doing so, Caesar demonstrated that, unlike the barbarians, Rome could carry entire armies across the Rhine in short order whenever it chose. He remained only long enough to intimidate the nearby tribes in the hope of dissuading further raids, before returning to Gaul and demolishing the bridge behind him. Barely half a century later, in the year 12 BC, prompted by further Germanic raids into Gaul, real attempts at conquest of Germania Magna began in earnest under leadership of Nero Claudius Drusus. His first expedition into the region managed to defeat various tribes. After initial successes, he traveled northwards along the Rhine, utilizing the Roman Rhine flotilla to keep his troops supplied. He continued using the ships as support vessels to travel along the coast in northwestern Germania before returning around winter. The following year, he once again launched an expedition across the Rhine, pushing eastwards all the way towards the Weser River. Various tribes along the way were defeated in battle. Naturally disgruntled about these campaigns into their lands, the first inklings of an anti-Roman alliance began to take shape. A loose collection of tribes worked together to attack the Romans on their return journey, successfully catching them in an ambush, but ultimately unable to defeat them. Drusus established a military camp at Obereden, large enough to accommodate at least 2 legions, using the camp as a staging point for new campaigns. The following year he proceeded to march south and established more forts east of the Rhine to bolster the Roman supply network before returning to Rome. After being elected to consul, Drusus launched his 4th expedition into Germania. The initial stages of the campaign would prove a particularly bloody affair. Afterwards, the Germanic tribes retreated before them to avoid pitched battles, allowing the Romans to march all the way toward the Elbe River. On the return journey, an accident during which Drusus fell off his horse resulted in broken bones, which became infected, causing him to die some 30 days later. Upon receiving the news, his brother Tiberius, who commanded Roman forces along the upper Danube, abandoned his own campaign and swiftly traveled north to assume command. Needless to say, the conquest of Germania continued. Over the years, command switched between various generals, with Rome continuing to win important victories over the Germanic tribes. Expeditions reached as far as the Elbe River. More fortresses were built, and the Romans even began the construction of a road network to improve communications and supplies. In the wake of this seemingly indomitable imperial war machine, many tribes submitted or even allied with Rome. The steady incorporation of the entirety of Germania appeared to progress remarkably well, but the Romans were at risk of falling for their own propaganda if they believed the German peoples were to be completely conquered. Beneath the surface of subjugation, resistance was taking shape. A Cheruscan noble and trusted ally of Rome, by the name of Arminius, betrayed the empire's trust and secretly organized a coalition of tribes against them. What followed was an unexpected and gruesome battle at Teutoberg forest in the year 9 AD. A series of brutal ambushes deep into the forests of Germania caused the utterly merciless annihilation of 3 entire Roman legions. Their precious eagle standards were taken as trophies of war by the victorious Germans, one of the greatest military catastrophes in Roman history. Such a humiliatingly one-sided defeat at mere barbarians shattered their misplaced belief that the region had largely been pacified, and ultimately led them to reconsider if the conquest of Germania was worthwhile. In the aftermath of Teutoberg, the Romans would truly come to appreciate the practicality of the Rhine and Danube as convenient and defensible natural barriers. A more defensive posture along the rivers was adopted, and they would henceforth serve as the principal frontiers of the empire. Germania was no longer regarded as another territory simply destined to fall under Roman rule. The imperial government increasingly weighed whether the rewards justified the cost of conquest. The warlike and headstrong Germans might very well cause more problems than their sparsely developed cities could produce in tax and resources to compensate for it. That is not to say that the Romans did not continue to project their influence and might onto the domains over the northern shores, for they very much did. Barely half a decade after the Battle of Teutoberg Forest, a Roman general by the name of Germanicus led a series of punitive expeditions into Germania, demonstrating the empire's resilience in a successful campaign of retribution that managed to reclaim 2 of the 3 lost legionary eagle standards. Several emperors would continue to campaign in Dacia, in the region largely corresponding to what we now call Romania. They successfully established a Roman province here that lasted over a century, until the instability of the 3rd century crisis compelled the empire to abandon the province and withdraw south of the Danube once again. Some Germanic peoples admired Roman civilization, even while resisting foreign rule. Rome itself had no qualms about opportunistically forging alliances with tribal chieftains positively predisposed towards the empire. all kinds of different political interference became part of Rome's foreign policy in an attempt to prevent the emergence of a unified Germanic power capable of threatening Rome's hegemony. Despite these efforts, the frontier remained far from peaceful. Tribal raiding parties frequently crossed the Rhine and Danube to plunder Roman settlements before retreating back beyond the rivers. In response, Roman armies periodically crossed over to perform punitive expeditions. Yet despite this recurring cycle of violence and bloodshed, trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange across the frontier continued to flourish. The armies stationed in Gaul, Illyricum, and Thrace cooperated with friendly tribes, and increasingly came to rely upon Germanic recruits and auxiliary troops to meet their demands for manpower. Though centuries of this intermingling, some Germanic tribes became more Romanized, and likewise, the Romans became increasingly influenced by the barbarians. Through a combination of sheer military might, cultural assimilation, political subterfuge, and calculated policy of divide and conquer, Roman resilience had always managed to find a way to recover from catastrophe and preserve their dominion.
If you are watching this video because you are into military history, I'm sure you will enjoy Warthunder. Warthunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and it is available for free on PC, consoles and even mobile devices. You can take command over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships of 10 different nations, ranging from historical vehicles from the early 20th century to modern tanks of today. Detailed vehicles, realistic graphics and the authentic sound design provides an immersive experience. You can join the worldwide community of Warthunder with 95 million players in their epic multiplayer battles. It has a game mode and vehicle for every type of player. Whether you like realism or a more arcade style, this game has it all. Warthunder is truly suited to the fans of military history, and you can sign up now for free. By using the links in the pinned comment or video description, you get a massive bonus pack available to new players. This includes exclusive vehicle decorations, in-game currency, 7 days of premium account and more. And if you already have a Warthunder account but haven't played for 6 months, you can use my links to get the same bonus. This offer is available for a limited time only, so don't forget to claim it now.
The Germanic peoples were far from sitting idly by as the empire sought to dictate their fate. Many of the tribes responsible for this defeat, such as the Cherusci, had faded into obscurity, to be replaced by peoples known by different names. Beyond the empire's borders, tribes forged new confederations, kingdoms, and alliances, and waged wars in pursuit of their own ambitions. It is worth outlining the territories and cultures of these tribal federations to better understand the peoples whom the Romans collectively labeled as barbarians, for many amongst them would go on to play pivotal roles in the centuries to come. It is however worth remembering that this is by no means an exhaustive list, and that we are largely using names by which the Romans knew them. These peoples themselves might not necessarily have identified with these labels in the same way, nor did they always represent cohesive political entities. Some tribes and regions appear only rarely in the historical record, which may reflect long periods of relative peace or simply limited contact with the Roman world. Meanwhile, many of the peoples most extensively documented earned that distinction due to frequent dealings with the Romans, often in the form of military conflict. Then again, these broad generalizations only scratch the surface, for the political, geographical, and cultural realities on the ground were undoubtedly complex and nuanced. Along the North Sea coast, just beyond the northernmost frontier of the Roman Empire, in what we now call the Netherlands, lay the domain of the Frisians. They were not a single united kingdom, but rather a collection of relatively small tribal communities inhabiting the coastal lands between the Rhine and the Ems rivers. Due to the low-lying wetlands, close proximity to the coast, and the crisscross of many river deltas, the lands they inhabited were prone to frequent flooding. The Frisians adapted by building their settlements on artificial earthen mounds, keeping both their dwellings and flocks safe during high tide. South of the Frisians, along much of the lower and middle Rhine in parts of what are now mostly Belgium, Luxembourg, and western Germany, lay the domains of the Franks. They are not a single tribe, but rather a flexible confederation of different Germanic peoples from the area. No Germanic people had a more complicated relationship with Rome than the Franks. They were known to be formidable warriors who frequently raided their neighbors and launched incursions deep into Roman Gaul to plunder Roman settlements. Unfortunately for the Romans, the domains of the warlike Franks lay along the lower Rhine, which were amongst the easier sections to cross. This, in combination with their proficiency in warfare, made them a thorn in the side of the empire. Unsurprisingly, over the centuries the area frequently saw military campaigns going back and forth, as both Rome and the Franks sought to establish dominion over the lands near the Rhine. For inhabitants in the region, the status of the conflict was often defined by whether or not they were able to peacefully farm the lands on the other side of the river. During the crisis of the 3rd century, the Franks are reported to have even raided all the way south towards the coastal city of Tarragona in Spain. Such an ambitious raid demonstrated that they were a force to be reckoned with, and a people whose ambitions extended far beyond the frontier. Although periodically pacified by military successes of the Roman legions, the Franks repeatedly managed to bounce back, earning for themselves a reputation as one of the fiercest and most troublesome peoples of the frontier, said to be more ferocious than other nations. While both sides were willing to fight each other, they were also open to negotiations. On several occasions, portions of Franks had even been allowed to peacefully settle in northern Gaul as foederati, paying taxes and supplying manpower for the Roman army. Significant numbers of Franks voluntarily entered in military service with the empire, serving as auxiliaries or mercenaries fighting to secure the frontier. Some amongst them even rose to the status of high-ranking officers within the Roman army, proving that this could be a worthwhile career path for ambitious Frankish warriors. Whether by brutal conflict or through cooperation, by the 4th century the Franks had firmly established themselves as one of the most dominant cultures along the empire's borders. The Saxons lived in the area of northern Germania and along the coast of the North Sea. Just like the Frisians and Franks, they were collections of smaller tribes. Saxon warbands became notorious as seaborne raiders. They launched attacks across the North Sea against the coasts of Gaul and Britain. These types of raids became so frequent that the Romans decided to build a chain of coastal forts, predominantly on the shores of Britannia, but also within Gaul, with the purpose to counter them. This network of fortifications on both sides of the English Channel became suitably known as the Saxon Shore. Farther to the north lay the homeland of the Angles, a people closely related to the Saxons in language and culture. It is possible that their warriors participated in some of the same raiding expeditions. It is worth mentioning that their simultaneous migration towards Britannia century later would give rise to the term Anglo-Saxons. The territory of the Alemanni lay southeast of the Franks, in the upper region of the Rhine and Danube north of the Alps. The domain is located right around the heart of the densely wooded Black Forest, which the Romans considered exceedingly difficult to traverse. It would, however, be a mistake to mischaracterize the Alemanni as typical primitive forest dwellers. Those familiar with Germanic languages will notice that their name can naturally be translated to mean all men, reflecting their origins as a confederation of several tribes. Relations between the Alemanni and Romans were presumably severely soured during the reign of Emperor Caracalla in the early 3rd century, who is said to have dealt with them treacherously. Thereafter, diplomacy between them was frequently overshadowed by conflict and mutual distrust. Although normally organized as a loose confederation of independent tribes, they were at times united under prominent kings during major campaigns. By periodically raiding the frontier regions of Gaul, and even the Po Valley in northern Italy itself, they secured for themselves a reputation as one of Rome's most formidable enemies. They were not always opposed to military service with the Roman army, and, like the Franks, became a source for recruitment and auxiliary troops. The Burgundians were originally associated with regions farther to the northeast, but gradually migrated southwest over the course of several centuries, likely to escape pressure from aggressive neighbors. Their migration through lands of other peoples undoubtedly brought them in competition with other tribes. but this did not stop them from eventually establishing a domain between the Franks and the Alemanni and gaining access to the Rhine. Once at the frontier, they began to replicate the opportunistic raids into Roman territory their neighbors were already known for. Their arrival in the region predominantly encroached upon domains of the Alemanni. The Romans were eager to exploit such rivalries and encouraged conflict between the two in order to weaken both. The peoples collectively known as Suebi make up an exceedingly large territory within Germania Magna. They are better understood as a very broad ethno-cultural grouping encompassing multiple tribes and confederations. Although not an exhaustive list of the Suebi, we shall describe some of the groups amongst them that are relevant for now. Towards the north are the Longobards, which can be translated to Longbeards, better known today as the Lombards. Many of the Lombards had begun a gradual migration southwards toward the Danube, likely across the lands of other Suebian peoples like the Semnones. Towards the south of Germania, on the shores of the upper and middle Danube, are two other Suebi peoples, by the names of the Marcomanni and Quadi, probably best known for their prominent roles in the Marcomannic Wars between 166 and 180, during which a broad coalition of Suebian tribes and their allies fought the Romans along the Danube. Even after the conclusion of the Marcomannic Wars, with Rome coming out on top and dictating the terms of peace, the region would largely remain tranquil for long. The Marcomanni and Quadi, along with the Lombards and neighboring Sarmatians, continued to exert pressure on the empire's Danubian frontiers. An interesting note is that these conflicts played a significant role during the reign of Marcus Aurelius. The long years of campaigning on the frontier provided much of the backdrop for his famed Stoic philosophical writings that would later be compiled as the Meditations. The Sarmatians were not Germanic in origin, but nomadic peoples from the Eurasian steppes that had migrated into Central Europe, and after whom the vast region of Sarmatia was named. Although the peoples of Germania certainly were familiar with horses themselves, the Sarmatians set themselves apart with their equestrian lifestyles that consequently produced expert mounted horse archers. Some among them migrated as far west as the Hungarian plain. These became known as the Yasigis, who gradually adopted a more sedentary way of life as they settled between the Middle Danube and Dacia. There they would become frequent allies of the Quadi, most notably during the Marcomannic Wars. After these wars, as part of the peace treaty with Rome, several thousand of their cavalrymen would serve with the empire. The Vandals were an East Germanic people who had migrated into Dacia during the Marcomannic Wars, entering the region as allies of Rome in exchange for promises of land. When Rome eventually began to withdraw from the region in 271, the power vacuum caused Dacia to become a patchwork of competing barbarian peoples. Pressured by the Goths arriving from the east, they were gradually forced out of Dacia. They subsequently appealed to Constantine the Great for permission to enter the Roman Empire, a request which was ultimately granted by settling them in Pannonia on the western side of the Danube. The Goths were perhaps some of the most influential Germanic people of this era, owing largely to their remarkable migration across Europe. Because of this, the Goths are often regarded as a catalyst for the displacement of neighboring peoples, contributing to a wider chain of migrations that reshaped Europe during late antiquity. It is likely they emerged from the Baltic region, gradually migrating south over the course of multiple generations, until by the 3rd century they had established themselves north of the Black Sea, where they divided into two groups, the Tervingi and the Gutringi. The Tervingi, generally regarded as the ancestors of the later Visigoths, entered the Dacian region between the Dniester and Danube River, where they came into contact with the Romans. Although arriving later on the Roman frontier than many others, through their frequent raids into the Roman provinces of Thrace, they quickly established a reputation as one of the most formidable and warlike peoples. Not merely content to plunder the countryside, their attacks frequently included besieging cities as well. They are one of the few barbarian peoples who can boast to have killed a Roman emperor. This feat occurred during the Battle of Abritus, where the Roman army pursued the Goths into a swamp where they got brutally ambushed. Emperor Decius and his son were killed alongside their men. The brutal incursions were not limited to the Danube frontier, but also included remarkably ambitious maritime expeditions. In collaboration with their allies, primarily the seafaring Herulians, they marauded the coasts of the Black Sea, but their ambitions did not stop there. Their ships carried them through the Bosporus to raid all the way towards the southern coasts of Greece. Reaching the Aegean Sea, they split up. Some of their ships reached as far as the islands of Crete and Rhodes. They managed to sack Athens and marched overland to sack even more cities like Corinth and Sparta. This unprecedented scale of devastating raids and battles, collectively known as the Gothic Wars, contributed greatly to the crisis of the 3rd century, and turned the Goths into one of the primary threats for the Roman Empire. Unsurprisingly, many Roman emperors preferred to pay them regular tributes instead of fighting them. At the start of the 4th century in 332, Constantine the Great entrusted his son Constantine II with command of the army in Thrace. He successfully led a crushing campaign against the Teutobergi and completely devastated their countryside. Famine soon arrived, and large amounts of Teutobergi, some say as many as 100,000, perished during harsh winter conditions. In the aftermath of this disaster, their leader Ariaric accepted a treaty that essentially turned them into a Roman client kingdom, obligating them to provide auxiliary troops and assist in the defense of the Danube frontier. Meanwhile, the Grutangi, who would later become known as the Ostrogoths, had settled east of the Dniester towards the Don River, in what is now considered Ukraine. They maintained close political and cultural ties with the Teutobergi, together forming the two principal Gothic confederations of the Pontic steppe. Compared to their western brethren, due to the geographical distance, they interacted less directly with the Romans. Instead, much of their contact with Roman culture came through the Greek colonies along the Crimean coast called the Bosporan Kingdom. These prosperous trading centers had been under Roman dominion for centuries and served as important ports for trade across the Black Sea. Last but not least, east of the Grutangi lay the domain of the Alani. Similar to the Yasigis, they are also a Sarmatian people whose nomadic culture revolved predominantly around an equestrian lifestyle. The Alani have been reported to frequently cross the natural barrier of the Caucasus Mountains to raid Roman provinces in Anatolia and Armenia instead. When the Goths expanded southwards onto the Pontic steppe, some Alani appear to have withdrawn eastwards across the Don River. Although periods of trade and cooperation existed between the two peoples, the Alani nevertheless retained their reputation as fearsome warriors. Some Alans became integrated into Gothic society. This close contact likely contributed to the growing prominence of cavalry within Gothic armies. As should become clear by now, the Roman Empire had its hands full in dealing with these many different tribes and confederations that lined its frontiers. In what can be best described as an empire-wide game of whack-a-mole, they endlessly marched their armies back and forth to counter-invading barbarians, only for another threat to pop up elsewhere. Repelling a major incursion or uprising demanded a substantial show of military force, the manpower for which the empire would have to pull from somewhere. An emperor's decision to send the legions to the defense of one region might expose it to raids somewhere else. When the legion marched away to face a new threat, raids almost inevitably continued not long after. Unless a punitive campaign or battle was sufficiently decisive to break a tribe's ability or willingness to fight, peace was often little more than temporary. By now, the cycle of raids and retaliations had endured for generations. Contrary to Rome's intentions, the centuries of imperial intervention across the frontier had contributed to the formation of ever larger barbarian confederations. Beyond the Rhine and Danube continued to live powerful neighbors, able and willing to contest Roman rule. The challenge confronting the empire had become ever greater. Much has changed over the centuries. Gone were the days where the square scutum, shield, gladius sword, pilum, and lorica segmentata characterized the Roman legions. Their panoply evolved until it increasingly resembled that worn by the barbarians. Oval and round shields, spathae, and new forms of helmets and armor had become the norm. An even larger proportion of barbarians were recruited into the army. Franks, Goths, Alemanni, and others entered Roman service in considerable numbers, until troops of barbarian origin formed a significant minority, possibly approaching as much as 25% of total forces. The empire no longer looked to Jupiter as the supreme god sanctioning Roman dominion, or Mars, the god of war, whose favor had long been invoked in battle. The ancient pantheon had given way to Christianity, not only changing the empire's religion, but also the ideals upon which its legitimacy was founded. Whether this change in theological foundation would strengthen or weaken the empire remained to be seen. During the early 4th century, the Teutoberg Goths had their own religious transformation to Christianity. The religion began to make inroads because the Goths captured many Christian prisoners of war. These captives were then taken to Gothic lands as slaves. Because Germanic paganism generally did not require exclusive worship of a single god, they were allowed to continue practicing their Christian religion. Gradual integration of these captive peoples into their societies caused the first Gothic Christian communities to form. Their conversion was truly set in motion in the year 341. A descendant from such captives by the name of Ulfilas became bishop of the Goths. He had been ordained by none other than Eusebius of Nicomedia, the very bishop who had baptized Constantine the Great on his deathbed. Ulfilas supervised the missionary work amongst the Teutoberg. As someone who had lived amongst the Goths himself, he was able to supervise the translation of the Bible from Greek to Gothic language. Although the Council of Nicaea had attempted to settle the dispute over the divinity of Christ and condemned the teachings of Arius, the controversy was far from over. Eusebius remained sympathetic towards the teachings of Arius. Upon consecration as bishop, Ulfilas became associated with this theological current as well. As a result, the Christianity that developed among the Goths would be regarded as Arianism rather than Nicene Christianity. Although this development may appear of relatively minor significance for now, the gradual Christianization of barbarian peoples would have a major impact on the centuries to come. Rome had weathered countless crises before, but this empire was clearly no longer the same as the one that had rebounded from the disastrous defeat at Teutoberg Forest. The years ahead would reveal whether the same resolve and resilience that had carried Rome through its greatest trials could be summoned once again. Far beyond the Roman frontiers, beyond even the vast forests of Germania and the endless grasslands of Sarmatia, a new people emerge on the horizon. From the distant steppes of Asia, a formidable new enemy marches steadily westward towards the banks of the Volga River. Surely it will not be long before they cross the river and enter the lands of the Alani. In the face of this looming threat from the east, perhaps the tribes of Germania will soon come to understand that the Romans were not the worst adversary they could face after all. In fact, the empire may prove to be their only refuge against the coming storm.
Thanks to Warthunder for sponsoring this history video. Before you go, don't forget to check out their amazing game, and if you want, you can use my links in the pinned comment or description to sign up for the exclusive welcome bonus pack.